Good evening, everybody. This is the Reading Club, and we're reading a book by Martin Luther King Jr. called Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? We had the foreword and the introduction. Was read a couple of weeks ago by Vincent Harding and Coretta Scott King. And we're on chapter 1, section 3, and that's where we left off last Wednesday and where we will pick up today. So if you could turn to page 12, and where do we go from here? Chaos or community? About 2/3 of the way down to section 3. I will start off reading, and hopefully someone else will pick up. You ready? Everybody ready?
Yes.
Ready.
Right. Thank you. Here we go. Meanwhile, frustration and a loss of confidence in white power have engendered among many Negroes a response that is essentially a loss of confidence in themselves. They are failing to appreciate two important facts. First, the line of progress is never straight. For a period, a movement may follow a straight line, and then it encounters obstacles and the path bends. It is like curving around a mountain when you are approaching a city. Often, it feels as though you are moving backwards and you lose sight of your goal. But in fact, you are moving ahead, and soon you will see the city again closer by. We are encountering just such an experience today. Inevitable counter-revolution that succeeds every period of progress is taking place. Failing to understand this as a normal process of development, some Negroes are falling into unjustified pessimism and despair. Focusing on the ultimate goal and discovering it's still distant, they declare no progress at all has been made. And don't we hear that a lot? People say nothing has changed. It's the same. Things change. And the late John Lewis used to tell people, if you don't think things have changed, go back and walk in my shoes. I continue to read. This mood illustrates another fact that has been misinterpreted. A final victory is an accumulation of many short-term encounters. They too lightly dismiss a success because it does not usher in a complete order of justice is to fail to comprehend the process of achieving full victory. It underestimates the value of confrontation and dissolves the confidence born of a partial victory by which new efforts are powered. The argument that the Negro has made no progress in a decade of turbulent effort rests on demonstrable facts that paint an ugly picture of stagnation in many areas, including income levels, housing, and schools. But from a deeper perspective, a different conclusion emerges. The increases in segregated schools and the expanded slums are developments confined largely to the North. Substantial progress has been achieved in the South. The struggle of the past decade were not national in scope, they were Southern. They were specifically designed to change life in the South. And the principal role of the North was supportive. It would be a serious error to misconstrue the movement's strategy by measuring Northern accomplishments when virtually all programs were applied in the South and sought remedies applicable solely to it. The historic achievement is found in the fact that the movement in the South has profoundly shaken the entire edifice of segregation. This is an accomplishment whose consequences are deeply felt by every Southern Negro in his daily life. It is no longer possible to count the number of public establishments that are open to Negroes. The persistence of segregation is not the salient fact of Southern experience. The proliferating areas in which the Negro moves freely is the new advancing truth. The South was the stronghold of racism. In the white migrations through history from the South to the North and West, racism was carried to poison the rest of the nation. Prejudice, discrimination, and bigotry had been intricately embedded in all institutions of Southern life, political, social, and economic. There could be no possibility of life transforming change anywhere so long as the vast and solid influence of Southern segregation remained unchallenged and unhurt. The 10-year assault at the roots was fundamentally to undermining the system. What distinguished this period from all preceding decades was that it constituted the first frontal attack on racism at its heart. So in other words, they went to where the hardest fight was to change it, which was the South, knowing that if they changed the South, the North and the West would follow. I wanted to take a quick break here to ask you all, of course, this book was written in the 60s, and we can look back from a historical standpoint now because it was over 40 years ago. But what do you guys think about the strategy? Was that strategy successful at the time?
I think it was successful at the time because no one was talking, well, they were talking about it, but no one was doing anything about it or had a coordinated plan for how to fix the problem of racism in the South.
Okay. Yeah, because I hear people today often say nothing has changed. Things are the same. And living in the Jim Crow South, as many things that look the same, and I do see us turning the clock back in some areas, I still see where there's progress. I can go down there and the places that I can frequent, that's huge. The ability to move freely, it's not 100%, but it's a lot better. So I think the strategy was a sound strategy. Like most things, we took our foot off the gas. And now we're falling backwards. One of the things Frederick Douglass taught us is never let up. Even if you have victory, don't let up. And as we go through this period in the 21st century, that's what I encourage people. When we have little victories, cherish the little victories, right? And regardless of the size of a victory, don't stop pushing. That's what I got out of the struggle. I continue to read. Since before the Civil War, the alliance of Southern racism and Northern reaction has been the major roadblock to all social advancement. The cohesive political structure of the South working through this alliance enabled the minority of the population to imprint its ideology on the nation's laws. This explains why the United States is still far behind European nations in all forms of social legislation. England, France, Germany, Sweden, all distinctively less wealthy than us, provide more security relative for their people. Hence, in attacking Southern racism, the Negro has already benefited not only himself but the nation as a whole. Remember, I said anytime barriers are removed from Black people, it advances all people. This is an example of that. Until a disproportionate political, I continue to read, until a disproportionate political power of the reactionary South in Congress is ended, progress in the United States will all be fitful and uncertain. And I take, for example, Lindsey Graham in South Carolina, inserting himself in Georgia politics. Liz Cheney in what is it, Montana or Missouri? I think Montana. And you have, I think, some guy named Getz going there to push the Southern agenda. After reading this, I can see how the South is sort of infecting the rest of the country with racism, bigotry, and white supremacy. Because people who are steeped in that today, where other people from other areas have broken free from it, now you have people from the South going back to tell the people there that they need a different elected official, working to unseat them within their own party. That's amazing. I continue to read. Since the beginning of the Civil Rights Revolution, Negro registration in almost every southern state has increased by at least 100%, and in Virginia and Alabama by 300 and 600% respectively. Wow. There are no illusions among Southern segregationists that these gains are unimportant. The old order has already lost ground. Its retreats are symbolized by the departure from public life of sheriffs Clark and Bull Connor. Far more important, the racists have restructured old parties to cope with the emerging challenge. In some states, such as Georgia and Alabama, white supremacy temporarily holds the state house. But it would be foolish and short-sighted politician, who felt secure with this victory. In both of these states, the most serious contender in recent elections was a white former governor who publicly welcomed the Negro vote, shaped his policies to it, and worked with Negro political organizations in the campaign. This change is itself a revolutionary event. This amazing transformation took place in 1 decade of struggle after 10 decades of virtually total disenfranchisement. The future shape of Southern politics will never again operate without a strong Negro electorate as a significant force. In modern days, we have seen this with the election of Warnock and Ossoff in Georgia. Two people that you would not have envisioned would be elected, the two senators representing, of all places, Georgia. That's the 21st century. That was the work that was done back then, and that was in black people seeing that they do have voting power. They have to register and then they have to vote. I continue to read. Even in Mississippi, where electoral advances are not yet marked, a different form of challenge is manifest. When Negroes decided to march for freedom across the state, they boldly advanced to the Capitol itself in a demonstration of 30,000 people. 10 years before, a Mississippi Negro would have submissively stepped to the gutter to leave the sidewalk for a white man. 10 years before a meeting, Negroes would have come together at night in the woods as conspirators. I like how he's showing how things have changed. A decade ago, not a single Negro entered the legislative chambers of the South except as a porter or chauffeur. Today, 11 Negroes are members of the Georgia House. Remember, this is back in the 60s. 10 years ago, Negroes seemed almost invisible to the larger society, and the facts of their harsh lives were unknown to the majority of the nation. Today, civil rights is a dominating issue in every state, crowding the pages of the press and the daily conversations of white America. In this decade of change, the Negro stood up and confronted his oppressor. He faced the bullets and the guns, the dogs and the tear gas. He put himself squarely before the vicious mobs and moved with strength and dignity toward them and decisively defeated them. Remember, this is the 1960s. For more than a century of slavery and another century of segregation, Negroes did not find mass unity, nor could they mount mass actions. The American brand of servitude tore them apart and held them in paralyzed solitude. But in the last decade, Negroes united and marched. And out of the new unity and action, vast monuments of dignity were shaped, courage was forged, and hope took concrete form. For hundreds of years, Negroes had fought to stay alive by developing an endurance to hardship and heartbreak. In this decade, the Negro stepped into a new role. He no longer would endure, he would resist and win. He still had the age-old capacity to live in hunger and want, but now he banished these as his lifelong companions. He could tolerate humiliation and scorn, but now he armed himself with dignity and resistance, and his adversary tasted the gall of defeat. For the first time in his history, the Negro did not have to use subterfuge as a defense or solicit pity. His endurance was not employed for compromise with evil, but to supply the strength to crush it. He came out of his struggle, integrated only slightly in the external society, but powerfully integrated within. This was the victory that had to precede all other gains. We need to remember that for today. He made his government write new laws to alter some of the cruelest injustices that affected him. He made an indifferent and unconcerned nation rise from lethargy and recognize his oppression and struggle with a newly aroused conscience. He gained manhood in a nation that always called him boy. These were the values he won that enlivened hope, even while sluggish progress made no substantial changes in the quality or quantity of his daily bread. The great deal the Negro had won in spiritual undergirding, and the great deal he has not won in material progress indicates the strengths and weaknesses in the life of the Negro in 1967. They also reveal that no matter how many obstacles persist, the Negro's forward march can no longer be stopped. The fight is far from over because it is neither won, as some assert, nor lost, as the calamity-ridden declare. Negroes have irrevocably undermined the foundations of Southern segregation. They have assembled the power through self-organization and coalition to place their demands on all significant national agendas. And beyond this, they have now accumulated the strength to change the quality and substance of their demands. From issues of personal dignity, they are now advancing to programs that impinge upon the basic system of social and economic control. At this level, Negro programs go beyond race and deal with economic inequality wherever it exists. In the purest of these goals, the white poor became involved, and the potentiality emerges for a powerful new alliance. After momentous gain of the last decade, it is now being taken for granted. Now he's right. We took it for granted. Negroes forged their own tactical theory of nonviolent direct action. It was born in Montgomery, Alabama, and for a time was considered of only limited application. But as it inspired and informed far-flung movements that included sit-ins, boycotts, and mass marches, it became clear that a new method of protest action had been born. When legal contests were the sole form of activity, the ordinary Negro was involved as a passive spectator. His interest was stirred, but his energies were unemployed. Mass marches transformed the common man into the star performer and engaged him in total commitment. Yet nonviolent resistance caused no explosions of anger. It instigated no riots. It controlled anger and released it under discipline for maximum effect. Now, I would say that's a juxtaposition against the January 6th insurrection. It's never happened with Negroes or black people in this country. I continue to read. What lobbying and imploring could not do in legislative halls, marching feet accomplished 1,000 miles away. When the Southern Christian Leadership Conference went into Birmingham in 1963, it intended to change that city. But the effect of its campaign was so extensive that President Kennedy was forced to conclude that national legislation was indispensable, and the first civil rights bill with substance was enacted in 1964. Nonviolent direct action had proved to be the most effective generator of change that the movement had seen. And by 1965, all civil rights organizations had embraced it as theirs. In the past year, nonviolent direct action has been pronounced for the 10th time dead. New tactics have been proposed to replace it. The Black Power slogan was described as a doctrine that reached Negro hearts with so deep an appeal that no alternative method could withstand its magnetic force. Rioting was described as a new Negro form of action that evoked results when disciplined demonstration sputtered out against implacable opposition. Yet, Black Power has proved to be a slogan without a program and with an uncertain following. If it is true that the controversy is not yet resolved, it is also true that no new alternative to nonviolence within the movement have found viable expression. Confusion has been created, but extensive despair and dissipation of fighting strength have not occurred. Well, that ends section 3 of chapter 1 of Where Do We Go From Here? KSR Community by Dr. King. And that's at the top of page 19. There's 4 pages to end this chapter. So if someone would else, well, first of all, did anybody have any comments on what we just read? If no one has any comments, would anyone like to read
I have just one little thing. I think it's at the end of page 16, beginning page 17. I think that sentence is to me, it's very powerful. Like the power from within.
Go ahead and read it, Gabriella.
Oh, it's a very short one. He says, he, talking about the Negro, he came out of his struggle integrated only slightly in the external society, but powerfully integrated with them. And I think, it seems like it was a change that happened over those 10 years. And if that's true, that's huge. That the African American community found that internal bond within.
So, Gabriella, you're right. That is a powerful sentence. And if you could read the paragraph following it, where it says he made his government right, if you could read that paragraph.
Sure. He made his government write new laws to alter some of the cruelest injustices that affected him. He made an indifferent and unconcerned nation rise from lethargy and recognize his oppression and struggle with a newly aroused conscience. He gained manhood in the nation that had always called him boy.
I thought that was pretty powerful when I read it. And I remember growing up in the South. That's what you were, is boy. It's like my name was Boy Rodney. Everybody's name started out with boy.
I think Dick called boy like an assistant at some point. Did you hear that gossip? That he called somebody like it was an official, and he called him boy, completely out of place. Yeah.
So I did think that was powerful. I'm glad you brought it up, because when we were reading it, it stood out to me. And that last sentence, he gained his manhood in the nation that had always called him boy. That is pretty powerful. And being one who was called boy as a pejorative, I understand exactly what it means. Did anybody else have anything that grabbed them from what we read? I just want to go with one more. It says, for hundreds of years, Negroes have fought to stay alive by developing an endurance to hardship and heartbreak. In this decade, the Negro stepped into a new role. He no longer would endure. He would resist and win. That was, do we see it like that in the 21st century? Maybe we should.
I don't think so, because of people of a certain age haven't had to have that endurance and survival technique that those who came before us had. So I don't know that they appreciate where we as a group has come from, much less what they can do, learning from the past to go forward.
You know what? One of the things
I agree with Waddell.
Oh, go ahead, General.
I was just going to say, I agree with Waddell. I think as much as the youth may think about it, I don't think they have the same wherewithal that our generation and even that before had, as far as the struggle and what was needed to come out of it. I don't think we're together like we were, on the same page like we were back then for the fight going forward. So I think all of that, like Waddell said, and these other things that I just mentioned, truly have a lot to do with it. We just, to me, have trouble coming together and having the same commitment, I think I'll say, that we had as a people back then.
Well, I think part to blame is the social mobility, because some African Americans they are like economically different, than others, and that maybe broke a little bit the internal bonds. I mean, you all share the racial thing in common, and everybody, even rich people, is scared of having their child driving a car when they are 18 and being stopped by the police. Thing in common, even with rich, like Black people. But many other things are not common anymore in terms of economics.
And there's oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, and to add to that, we talked about being thrown a bone or those type of things. You give enough of us jobs, and we start to believe that everything is fine.
Right.
When we had these high-paying jobs in manufacturing, those type of things, that kind of, as Rodney said, as we related to in the book, we took the foot off the gas because we thought we had arrived, but we had not. We just impasse.
You know what? And that's what I tell young people who sometimes ask what happened. And I have to remind them, just like what the writer's saying, Dr. King is saying, was there was definitely progress. There was major progress. But, where the fault lies, if we're looking for fault, and oftentimes people are, I would say the fault is that we believed the system. In other words, the laws are passed, and the country is supposed to be this one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Well, now that the laws, we fall in those laws, okay, everything is going to be good now. And that was a huge mistake. Huge. I don't fault my elders for it, and even my generation for continuing, because my generation continued it. But we didn't know any better. And we believed that this is how it's going to be from here on out. What we didn't take into consideration is it wasn't the laws that caused racism and white supremacy and segregation. The laws codified it, but it was what was in people's minds that led to the laws, that led to the segregation and all of the horrible things that happened. And so when we changed the laws, we did change the laws. But what we didn't do is we didn't change the minds of the people in the South. And as a matter of fact, there was a coalition, a body of people in the South who had grabbed hold of power to ensure that the ideology of the old South would be deemed culture, not hate, not racism. And that has done a lot to perpetuate this still in the minds of Southerners and Southern-minded people.
Yeah, I also thought part of what you read was talking about moving from the South to infect the rest of the country. You see people from California and just all over the nation being elected as what they're now terming as Trump acolytes, but they're really just racists who are trying to bring back that Southern agenda from a long time ago. And we haven't seen it. You're right. We haven't seen it as that. We look at them as performance politicians or just crazy people, but they are actually, while we're looking at those people in the show, backstage, they're changing laws, gutting civil rights and gutting voting rights, changing laws, making it harder to vote. And we hear about them, and as soon as we hear about them, someone else will perform loudly, and we will look at them, and we don't pay attention to what Mitch McConnell's trying to do in the Senate to keep the filibuster and threaten that if you get rid of the filibuster, we're going to cause trouble. Well, no, you can't cause trouble without the filibuster because you're not in power. So it seems like a coordinated performance, keep us looking in the wrong direction while they rebuild the old South.
I remember years ago when I used to bring up, and we have 4 pages to read, and we'll get to it here shortly in a few minutes, but I remember years ago when I would talk about being born in America, but not being born a full citizen. And people would always like, what do you mean, Rodney? And I say, because when I was born, Black people didn't have full voting rights. And without full voting rights, you cannot be a full citizen. And of course, they would say, what do you mean you don't have full voting rights? Well, I was born before the Voting Rights Act. Heck, I was born before the Civil Rights Act, right? So up because of Jim Crow, none of us who were born before the mid-60s were born as full citizens, even though our families have been citizens and we were considered citizens. I would often say people who immigrate to this country would often talk about, I'm the first, I'm the first, meaning they're the first generation that was born in this country. I'm first generation. Well, when people would immigrate to this country, they would get full citizenship rights. Black people, up until the Voting Rights Act, didn't have full citizenship rights. So then it came down to, okay, when I was born into this country, I didn't have full citizenship rights, but my children who were born in the 80s had full citizenship rights. Well, then I said, well, no, my children are not even the first generation to have full voting rights, to be born with full voting rights. And so they would say, well, what do you mean? I said, because periodically Congress has to reapprove the Voting Rights Act. And folks didn't understand why that was important. They said, but you have it. I said, no, I have it temporarily. Temporarily. Who else has a right temporarily? What is a temporary right? And if it is a right, why does someone have to routinely or continuously approve that right? Now I look at what's going on in about 11 states, maybe more now, that are turning back rights to vote. And it's not, this time, it's not just rights of Black people, right? It's even worse than that. They're turning back rights of white people. So you know it's bad. But that's what happens because people feel so threatened. And so the Voting Rights Act never should have been something that was temporary. A right is supposed to be God-given, inalienable. That should have been something that we should always have. Lastly, I would leave you with this. Why is it that whether we're Black, and now we're seeing it with violence against Asians, why is it that we have to continually make laws to prevent white people from exercising violence against other people? Okay. Chapter 4, the top of page 19. Did anyone want to read? We have 4 pages to go.
I can read, but just a little bit so I don't make everybody miserable. It's just a little, okay? 3 paragraphs. Then I pass it on to Waddell.
Okay.
Okay, I read. By 1967, the resounding shout of the Negro's protest had shattered the myth of his contentment. The courage with which he confronted enraged mobs dissolved the stereotype of the grinning, submissive Uncle Tom. Indeed, by the end of a turbulent decade, there was a new quality to Negro life. The Negro was no longer a subject of change. He was the active organ of change. He powered the drive. He set the pace. At the same time, it had become clear that though white opposition could be defeated, it remained a formidable force capable of hardening its resistance when the cost of change was increased. The daily life of the Negro is still lived in the basement of the Great Society. He is still at the bottom, despite the few who have penetrated so slightly higher levels. Even where the door has been forced partially open, mobility for the Negro is still sharply restricted. There is often no bottom at which to start, and where there is almost always no room at the top.
Yep.
Okay, pass it on. Well,
Thank you, Gabby. I will.
okay.
If my eyesight will let me continue today.
Okay.
The northern ghetto dweller still lives in a schizophrenic social milieu. In the past decade, he supported and derived pride from the Southern struggles and accomplishments. Yet the Civil Rights Revolution appeared to drain energy from the North, energy that flowed south, transformed life there, while stagnation blanketed Northern Negro communities. It was a decade of role reversal. The North, heretofore vital, languished, while the traditional passive South burst with dynamic vigor. North at best stood still as the South caught up. Civil rights leaders had long thought the North would benefit. Meanwhile, I focus.
Derivatively.
That's it. Derivatively.
No, I'm trying to focus. Like I said, one of my eyes is worse than the other, so I can hold the book at a certain angle.
I thought you were stuck by the complexity of that word.
Civil rights leaders had long thought the North would be would benefit derivatively. I can read it, but I can't say it. From the Southern struggle. They assumed that without massive upheavals, certain systematic changes were inevitable, and the whole nation re-examined and searched its conscience. This was a miscalculation. It was founded on the belief that opposition to the North was not intransigent, that it was flexible and was, if not fully, at least partially, hospitable to corrective influences. We forgot what we knew daily in the South. Freedom is not given, it is won. Concentration of effort in the large northern cities can no longer be postponed in favor of Southern campaigns, but must now be sustained. In assessing the results of the Negro Revolution so far, it could be concluded that Negroes have established a foothold. No more. We have written a Declaration of Independence, itself an accomplishment, but the efforts to transform the words into a life experience still lies ahead. The original great lie.
Mm-hmm.
The hard truth is that neither Negro nor white has yet done enough to expect the dawn of a new day. While much has been done, it has been accomplished by too few and on a scale too limited for the breadth of the bold. Freedom is not won by a passive acceptance of suffering. Freedom is won by struggling against suffering. By this measure, Negroes have not yet paid the full price of freedom, and whites have not yet faced the full cost of injustice. The brunt of the Negroes' past battles was borne by a very small strike force. Though millions of Negroes were ardent and passionate supporters, only a modest number were actively engaged, and these were relatively too few for a broad war against racism, poverty, and discrimination. Negroes fought and won, but our engagements were skirmishes, not climactic battles. No great victories are won in a war for the transformation of a whole people without total participation. Less than this will not create any new society, or not create a new society. It will only evoke more sophisticated token ameliorations. The Negro has been wrong to toy with the optimistic thought that the breakdown of whites' resistance could be accomplished at small cost. He will have to do more before his pressure crystallizes new white principles and new responses. The two forces must continue to collide as Negroes' aspirations burst against the ancient fortress of status quo. This should not be construed as a prediction of violence. On one hand, there will certainly be new expressions of nonviolent direct action on an enlarged scale. If 100,000 Negroes march in a majority city to a strategic location, they will make municipal operations difficult to conduct. They will exceed the capacity of even the most reckless local governments to use force against them, and they will repeat this action daily if necessary. Without harming persons or property, they can draw as much attention to their agreements as the outbreak of Watts, and they will have asserted their unwavering determination while retaining their dignity and discipline. But on the other hand, it cannot be taken for granted that Negroes will adhere to nonviolence under any and all conditions. When there is rock-like intransigence or sophisticated manipulations that mock the empty-handed petitioner, rage replaces reason. Nonviolence is a powerful demand for reason and justice. If it is rudely rebuked, it is not transformed into resignation and passivity. Southern segregationists in many places yielded to it because they realized that alternatives could be intolerable. Northern white leadership has relied too much on tokens and substitutes, and on Negro patience. The end of the road is clearly in sight. The cohesive, potentially explosive Negro community in the North has a short fuse and a long train of abuses. Those who argue that it is hazardous to give warnings, let the expression of apprehension lead to violence, are in error. Violence has already been practiced too often, and always because remedies were postponed. It is understandable that the white community should fear the outbreak of riots. They are indefensible as weapons of struggle, and Negroes must sympathize with whites who feel menaced by them. Indeed, Negroes are themselves no less menaced, and those living in the ghetto always suffer most directly from the destructive turbulence of a riot. Yet, the average white person also has a responsibility. He has to resist the impulse to seize upon the rioters as the exclusive villain. He has to rise up with indignation against his own municipal, state, and national governments to demand that the necessary reforms be instituted, which alone will protect him. If he reverses his resentment only for the Negro, he will be the victim by allowing those who have the greatest culpability to evade responsibility. Social justice and progress are the absolute guarantors of riot prevention.
Yep.
There is no other answer. Constructive social change will bring certain tranquility. Evasion will merely encourage turmoil. Negroes hold only one key to the double lock of peaceful change. The other is in the hands of the white community.
And there is the end of chapter 1 of Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community by Martin Luther King Jr. Well, any comments from those last 4 pages or anything that ties into the overall theme of the first chapter?
Some things have not changed when we talk about the anatomy of riots. People who are too slow to respond to demands and people who are too impatient to wait for the process to work.
There is something that strikes me both when we read Why We Can Wait and Where Do We Go From Here, is the emphasis that Dr. King always puts on discipline. And I think that was like the secret sauce for how successful he was in leading the civil rights movement, like the discipline. And I think that's something for to remember always when we have tried to use the strategy, the protest, the way he did it. It was magnificent. It was just ahead of his time. And I think that's one of the major reasons why he made so much change. Of course, he didn't do it himself. He did it with the community, and he couldn't have done it without them. But he was a great leader, and I think that was an element. And he always remembered about the discipline. We just read a few paragraphs when he went back to the discipline, and I was like, okay, I see that's the key element for you, and I see why.
I think, Gabby, you hit on a good point, because the discipline, I think, gave them sustainability in a lot of efforts, because a lot of these things that they did bring about change in didn't happen with one march. It happened with many marches and protests over long periods of time. I don't know in general if we have had the persistence and the longevity that he and his people had in their day. But I do see the Black Lives Matter protests and movement with the potential to rival what happened in King's Day, because we see it spread all over the country, north, south, and it is spread throughout the world.
But you guys feel like I do that, like leading a crowd who is frustrated, right? You have to be so skillful, because chances are that they are going to turn into an angry mob, right? So I think that's why for him the discipline was so essential, and I get it. I mean, it's not like leading a crowd to celebrate something. It's people who are hurting, and yes. So discipline. Look what happened with Trump supporters. Look what, that's the tendency. That's when you are leading an angry crowd, most likely they will turn into a mob. And like you're right. I think Black Lives Matter. They are pretty well put together when it comes to protest.
I would agree and disagree. They have the critical mass to affect change, but they don't have the discipline of that era of the 60s. And I often wondered how Dr. King would have handled the internet. We just don't have enough leaders of his caliber, well, not even of his caliber, enough disciplined leaders to seize that Black Lives Matter movement through social media and direct it for a purpose. And it does. You're right. It turns into a mob when you don't have discipline. And you're right. As the other book we read talked about how they spent so much time interviewing people who were going to be in those protests, make sure that they weren't going to be a part of the problem, to put it shortly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So,
part of the problem.
Yeah. So Rodney's right. I believe that it does have the potential, but it doesn't have the discipline. And it has right on its side, and it has all of the elements of shareholders who want to see things change for the better, but we just lack the discipline in that area.
So I would go back to what sort of this, I think it was section 3 is where we started out. I'll go back with how it started out, and he talked about how we shouldn't let setbacks take away from the victory. So in other words, you kind of gain ground and you lose a little bit, and then we say, well, look, we're right back where we started from.
The part of the mountain? when you are getting close to the city. That's what it is.
Right. So, yeah, because it's there, and yeah, it looked close, and all of a sudden now it makes, in some cases, disappear, or you don't see as much of it. But as you get closer and you round the bend, all of a sudden there's all of the glory of the city with all of its lights. I think sometimes when we get into those darker areas, we forget the progress, and then we kind of go, woe is me, man, I did all of this for nothing, and we stop. And when we stop, we miss on advancing to the real progress and see the lights of the city. So I think that in chapter 3, that's how he talks about it. He talks about the frustrations and the loss of confidence, because it seems like we're not advancing, or we're putting in all of this effort and work, but it hasn't come to fruition yet. And what he's saying is, no, you gotta stay the course. You got to keep pushing. And he also outlines a lot of the progress that they did make because they stayed the course and they kept pushing. And then they got a chance to see it manifest, because then it became a movement. Remember, he said that the Southern Christian leadership started it. A lot of other people didn't believe in it. But then once they had the successes in Alabama and other places, that nonviolent protest, nonviolent resistance sort of became the de facto methodology of all other organizations striving for these same things. So today, we do see the clock being turned back with a bunch of laws in a bunch of states. But what Dr. King says is that it's almost inevitable that look how much Black participation increased. And then look at the changes, the political changes that came about because of that participation. I will bring that to modern times and say, remember, Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff are the senators of Georgia. That happened because people like Stacey Abrams reminded us of the political clout, the political power that we carry in reserve. And she says, unleash it and take it from potentiality to reality. And that's what brought about those changes. And he also talked about white people and how these things affect white people too. And often I have said that white people have benefited from Black people because we're the canaries in the coal mine. What happens to us is a warning that if something isn't done to change what's happening to Black people, eventually it will happen to white people also. And that is what we're seeing today, is instead of Jim Crow laws just affecting Black people, now voting rights laws are being turned back that affect white people and others. Maybe other groups didn't always support the causes of Black people. Maybe they bought into the white supremacy. Not all, but some. And now some of those groups, like our Asian and brothers and sisters, who some have always supported us, but many have treated us like white people. Well, now they are being treated like Black people. And some people say, well, they're getting a taste of it. This is what they get for not supporting us. I remind them of so many instances where many did support us, and we cannot be like our oppressor. Those who are being oppressed have a common bond, and this is the time for us as Black people to join in with those other people who are being oppressed, and violence is being enacted upon them, like our Asian, American, and Pacific Island brothers and sisters. This is when we need to rally around them in support. And because now, believe me, if they didn't get it before, they're getting it now. And this is the time for us to show up for them, because eventually it's going to take the combined effort, as Dr. King, of all the oppressed people to overcome that oppression of white people until enough white people decide to fight it alongside of us. Did anybody else have anything? If not, that would be the conclusion of chapter 1 of Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. Next Wednesday at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, West Coast time, we will be right back here, and we will be in chapter 2. And chapter 2, especially for those folks who call themselves revolutionaries, is titled Black Power. Black Power. So I hope that you will join us again next week for our reading of chapter 2 of Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? A question that was asked by Dr. King in the 60s, a question that we're asking now in the 21st century of 2021. Does anybody have anything before we sign off? I tell you what, let's just go around the screen with just closing comments. Gabriella, Waddell, and then the general.
No, I enjoy the reading. I think I already was putting my penny every time I really have to say something. I'm done right now.
All right. Thank you, Gabriella, for joining us, and thank you for reading. Waddell.
I think it was a good start to the book. Already revealed some things that we need to, I think, work on as far as discipline and targeting what it is we want to accomplish.
Hence the Black Leadership Summit. I think it has the opportunity to help focus, to help bring us together as a collective so that we can work more as a unit, which will give us greater opportunity for victory. And even a small victory, we should embrace it and not reject it because it wasn't bigger and it wasn't more. General, did you have any closing comments for us?
I pretty much agree with several of the things Waddell said. And one thing that came up was the idea of a setback. And I do not remember the quote of a setback actually being something that's used to step up and move forward. No matter what the setback is, you learn as you learn from it. You should learn from it and know how to move forward using that setback. So I don't believe any setback that we have could be totally negative. The other thing is, I've said it before, and I still say it again today, that one of the things we're lacking is we're not all on the same page as a people, but we also don't have any one or two national leaders that can speak up and speak for us nationwide to help bring us together and move as one or organization, if you will, as one body with the same mind. So we're lacking there, and I think that really hurts us today. But overall, it is still a fight that we're all in, and we just have to keep pushing forward. And a lot of things that he says in his books, in this book, gives us something to think about and move on. That's it. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Where do we go from here? Chaos or Community? Next week, we'll be reading chapter 2, and it's called Black Power. 5 o'clock next Wednesday. Hopefully, I'll see you here. All right, everybody. Have a good evening and have a good week. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night. Good night.
Good night, guys. Thank you. Bye-bye.